Berlin, April 1945. As Soviet forces tighten their grip, the Third Reich crumbles from within. In his underground Führer bunker, Adolf Hitler has just taken his own life, leaving behind a shattered regime and a power vacuum no one can truly fill. Around him, the once mighty Nazi inner circle is descending into chaos. Some are fleeing, others turning on each other, and a few following their leader into death. This is the story of how Hitler's inner circle unraveled when the war was lost and survival was the only thing left to fight for. Joseph Goebbels had always been more than Hitler's minister of propaganda. He was his shadow, his echo, and in the regime's final hours, its most unwavering disciple. As Berlin burned and the Soviets closed in, Goebbels remained by the Führer's side in the bunker, refusing every offer of escape. On May 1, 1945, just one day after Hitler's death, Goebbels and his wife Magda poisoned their 6 young children while they slept. Then, stepping into the garden above, they took their own lives, leaving behind a smoldering legacy built on lies, manipulation, and blood. For Goebbels, surrender was unthinkable. He had long believed that Nazism was more than politics, it was destiny. Without Hitler, he saw no future worth living in. He once wrote that propaganda must be as enduring as granite, and in many ways his life ended in service of that idea. To Goebbels, martyrdom wasn't a loss, it was a message. Over 12 years he had perfected the art of turning ideology into illusion. Through radio broadcasts, newspapers, films, and mass rallies, Goebbels transformed Hitler into a messianic figure and rebranded genocide as patriotism. He wasn't a loud dictator like Göring or a cold planner like Himmler. He was a storyteller, and his narrative was relentless. Every speech, every poster, every headline bent the truth until it broke. He gave ordinary Germans something to believe in, even as he led them into ruin. Goebbels knew words could do what bullets couldn't. He used fear as fuel, demonized the Jews, justified war, and painted every setback as a test of national will. Even when Berlin was reduced to rubble, he insisted Germany would rise again. His infamous Total War speech in 1943 rallied the German people to sacrifice everything, even as the war had already been lost. In the end, Joseph Goebbels died exactly as he lived, devoted to an illusion. His death wasn't a final act of desperation, but a closing scene he had scripted in his mind long before the Red Army arrived. In the final weeks of the Third Reich, Heinrich Himmler, once the architect of terror, the cold-blooded master of the SS, found himself cast out and alone. For over a decade, he had built a vast empire of surveillance, repression, and death. He had overseen the Gestapo, commanded the concentration camps, and orchestrated the genocide of millions. But as Nazi Germany collapsed, the man who once wielded near-absolute power found the door to Hitler's inner circle slammed shut. Desperate to salvage his future, Himmler attempted what must have seemed to him a masterstroke of pragmatism. He tried to negotiate peace with the Western allies behind Hitler's back. Through intermediaries, he suggested that Germany could still fight on, just not against Britain or America. Instead, he proposed an alliance against the Soviets, believing that the West would prefer Nazi order to Bolshevik chaos. It was a fatal miscalculation. The Allies dismissed his overtures outright, and word of his betrayal reached Hitler. Hitler was furious. To him, Himmler's attempts at diplomacy was nothing short of treason. The man, once considered one of Hitler's most loyal lieutenants, was immediately stripped of all titles and expelled from the Nazi Party. In a final twist of humiliation, his name was no longer to be spoken in official circles. Himmler, who had sent countless people to their deaths without remorse, was now running, not from justice, but from insignificance. In May 1945, with Berlin fallen and the Nazi regime in ruins, Himmler disguised himself as a low-ranking army officer named Heinrich Himmler. He wore an eye patch, carried false papers, and attempted to blend in with retreating German troops. But he was soon detained at a British checkpoint near Bremerförde. His face was too familiar, his disguise too poor. Within days, his true identity was uncovered. Imprisoned in British custody, Himmler seemed calm, even arrogant. But on May 23rd, during a routine medical examination, he bit into a cyanide capsule tucked into a gap in his teeth. He collapsed within seconds, his mouth foaming, his body convulsing on the floor. The man who had orchestrated mass murder and demanded obedience unto death had refused to face judgment himself. Once Hitler's designated successor and the self-styled face of Nazi grandeur, Hermann Göring ended the war not with a triumphant salute, but in a cell, stripped of his titles, bloated from addiction, and desperate to reclaim lost relevance. As Berlin collapsed, Göring believed the time had come to assume leadership. From his retreat in Bavaria, he sent a telegram to Hitler asking for permission to take control. It was a calculated move, grounded in the succession plan Hitler himself had signed. But in the Führerbunker, paranoia ruled. Martin Bormann intercepted the message, spun it as treason, and convinced Hitler to strip Göring of all authority. The man once paraded in gold-threaded uniforms was now branded a traitor. Göring was captured by American forces on May 6, 1945. He surrendered with pride, dressed immaculately and surrounded by trunks of fine clothing, cigars, and stolen art. He greeted the Allies with civility, even charm, fully believing he could negotiate his way into a new role, perhaps as a mediator between the West and post-Nazi Germany. But the world was no longer interested in Reich marshals. Göring was arrested, interrogated, and sent to face trial at Nuremberg. Inside the courtroom, Göring came alive again. He saw the proceedings not as a reckoning, but as a stage. Fluent in English and quick with sarcasm, he toyed with prosecutors and sparred with witnesses. He painted himself as a misunderstood patriot, claiming he had opposed some of Hitler's worst excesses, even as evidence piled up of his deep complicity. From the formation of the Gestapo to the plunder of Europe and the final solution, Göring had been everywhere and denied everything. He wore his past like a costume he could take off at will. But the show didn't save him. In 1946, he was found guilty on all counts: crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The sentence was death by hanging. Göring, ever vain, petitioned for a soldier's execution by firing squad. The tribunal refused. He would hang like the others. Then, just hours before the sentence was to be carried out, Göring cheated the gallows by swallowing a cyanide capsule smuggled into his cell, most likely by a sympathetic guard. When the guards entered his cell, they found him slumped on the floor, his body already cold. Even in death, Göring had stolen the moment, denying his captors the spectacle they had prepared. His death was his final manipulation, an act of control in a world where power had evaporated. The man who once embodied the Nazi regime's theatrical brutality exited not in disgrace, but on his own terms. As the Third Reich crumbled around him, Martin Bormann vanished into the smoke. On May 1, 1945, just hours after Hitler's death, Bormann was last seen fleeing the Führerbunker with a small group of loyalists, slipping into the ruins of Berlin under Soviet fire. Unlike Göring or Himmler, he didn't negotiate or surrender, he simply disappeared. And in doing so, he became the ghost of the Nazi regime, everywhere and nowhere, a figure whispered about in post-war shadows, his fate unknown. Bormann had never craved the spotlight. His power came from proximity and paperwork. As Hitler's private secretary and head of the party chancellery, he controlled access to the Führer, filtered information, and bent decisions in his favor. He had no grand speeches or flamboyant uniforms, but behind the scenes he outmaneuvered rivals, isolated Hitler from dissent, and shaped the Nazi state in his own cold, bureaucratic image. By 1943, he was arguably the second most powerful man in Germany, yet most Germans barely knew his name. When the war ended, the Allies wanted answers, but Bormann was gone. Rumors surged like wildfire. Some claimed he had escaped to South America, aided by secret Nazi networks. Others insisted he was living under an assumed name in Soviet territory, protected for his knowledge. Over the decades, intelligence agencies chased phantom ideas. Bormann sightings in Argentina, Brazil, even Eastern Europe. He became a myth, a symbol of justice delayed, and a convenient ghost in the stories of former Nazis who needed someone to blame. In 1946, the Nuremberg trial tried Bormann in absentia. He was found guilty of all war crimes and crimes against humanity and sentenced to death. The sentence hung in the air like an unresolved chord, a reminder that one of the regime's most powerful men had simply vanished. It wasn't until 1972 that the mystery cracked. During construction work near Berlin's Lehrter train station, workers unearthed 2 human skeletons buried in a shell crater. Dental records confirmed what had long been suspected. One of the bodies was Martin Bormann. Tests revealed that he had died in May 1945, likely by biting a cyanide capsule as Soviet forces closed in. He hadn't fled across oceans, he hadn't been hiding, he had died in the dirt, just another corpse in a city of ruins. Albert Speer liked to say he didn't know. Not about the camps, the mass executions, the slave laborers who died building his factories. He knew about architecture, about order, about rebuilding Germany into a monumental empire of steel and stone. He knew how to please Hitler, first with dreams, then with weapons. But when the war ended and the spotlight turned, Speer insisted he hadn't known what those dreams had cost. Arrested by Allied forces in 1945, Speer stood trial at Nuremberg as the former Minister of Armaments and War Production, responsible for sustaining Germany's war machine long after it should have crumbled. But unlike the others, he didn't bark denials or lash out at the court. He expressed remorse. He called Hitler's dictatorship a moral catastrophe. And perhaps most significantly, he admitted some measure of guilt. It wasn't enough to spare him a sentence, but it set him apart. While others swung from the gallows, Speer was sentenced to 20 years in Spandau prison. Inside those cold walls, he wrote, and when he was released in 1966, he published. His memoir, Inside the Third Reich, became an international bestseller. Calm, introspective, and unnervingly articulate, the book painted him as a man who had been too ambitious, too obedient, but never cruel. It was a masterstroke of self-preservation, an image of the good Nazi, the technocrat who built without asking too many questions. The world, eager for clean narratives, embraced it. Speer became a fixture on television and in newspapers, discussing the dangers of blind loyalty in totalitarian regimes. He spoke of his regret, of missed chances to act, of a moral fog he claimed he only realized too late. For many, it was enough. He was cast as a cautionary tale, not a monster. But time sharpened the questions Speer tried to blur. Historians uncovered documents showing that he had attended meetings where the exploitation of slave labor was discussed in detail. Survivors described the brutal conditions in factories he oversaw. His denials began to fray at the edges. The remorse, it seemed, had boundaries. The debate never faded. Was Speer genuinely unaware of the full extent of Nazi atrocities, or was he simply a gifted manipulator who understood that repentance, or the appearance of it, could buy him a second life? His charm, intellect, and strategic guilt had allowed him to reshape his legacy in a way others could not. But beneath the polished words and sober reflections lay a truth harder to erase. Speer made the Reich function longer, deadlier, and more efficiently. He died in 1981, a free man. To some, he was a symbol of redemption, to others, of the lies people tell to survive history. He called himself a cog in the machine, but history remembers that he helped build it and kept it running until the bitter end. Rudolf Hess once stood at Hitler's side, a loyal deputy and one of the earliest true believers in the Nazi cause. By the end, he had become a ghost trapped in a cell, a man forgotten by history yet kept alive by the weight of his own myth. His fall from power began not with betrayal or defeat, but with a solo flight across enemy skies, a mission so bizarre it remains one of the war's strangest episodes. In May 1941, with World War II raging and his influence within the Nazi hierarchy fading, Hess climbed into a Messerschmitt Bf-110 and flew to Scotland. He parachuted into a farmer's field and claimed he had come to negotiate peace between Germany and Britain. No one in London took him seriously. To Churchill, he was either mad or delusional, possibly both. Hess was arrested and held in Britain for the remainder of the war, a relic of a regime that had moved on without him. At the Nuremberg trials in 1946, Hess reappeared, frail and blank-eyed, claiming memory loss and detachment from reality. Medical experts debated whether he was faking. The tribunal didn't care. Despite being sidelined from key war decisions, his role as Hitler's deputy during the regime's rise was undeniable. He was sentenced to life in prison and sent to Spandau, a forbidding fortress in Berlin that would become his cage for the next 4 decades. As the other Nazi prisoners were gradually released, Baldur von Schirach, Albert Speer, Hess remained. The Cold War made him a political chess piece. The Soviets insisted he serve his full sentence, and so he did. Year after year, alone in a prison designed for 7 men but housing only 1, his days were filled with routine, long walks in the prison yard and meticulous journaling. His isolation was broken only by the rotating guards of the 4 occupying powers and rare visits from family. Over time, he became a symbol of unresolved justice, of political stubbornness, of the strange twilight that followed the Nazi era. Supporters on the far right claimed he was a martyr, a man punished not for crimes but for peace efforts. In August 1987, at the age of 93, Rudolf Hess was found hanged in a small garden shed inside Spandau. Officially, it was a self-inflicted death. But conspiracy theories flourished, claims of murder, of secrets silenced too late. The British investigation confirmed the cause of death, but the whispers never stopped. His body was later exhumed and cremated. his grave destroyed to prevent it from becoming a shrine. Karl Dönitz wasn't supposed to lead the Third Reich. He wasn't a politician, a propagandist, or a party ideologue. He was a naval officer, disciplined, calculating, and loyal to a fault. But in Hitler's final will, written just hours before his death, Dönitz was named President of the Reich, tasked with leading what remained of a crumbling empire. The choice stunned even Dönitz. He had no connection to the inner workings of the Nazi Party's brutality, but in Hitler's paranoid logic, Dönitz represented order, obedience, and the military values the Führer clung to until the end. From his base in the northern town of Flensburg, Dönitz presided over what became known as the Flensburg government, a short-lived, hollow regime that existed in name only. His authority was limited, his resources non-existent, and the war was already lost. But in those final weeks of May 1945, he tried to salvage something from the wreckage. He negotiated surrender terms with the Allies, hoping to ensure the safety of as many German troops and civilians as possible. He insisted it was not about prolonging the war, but about controlling the terms of collapse. The Allies were not impressed. On May 23rd, the British arrested Dönitz and his cabinet, bringing an end to the last remnants of Nazi authority. At the Nuremberg trials, Dönitz stood apart from the monsters beside him. He had not orchestrated genocide, he had not built camps or given orders to exterminate civilians, but he had commanded the German Navy throughout the war, authorized unrestricted submarine warfare, and loyally served a murderous regime. His defense hinged on military necessity and on the claim that Allied navies had done the same. In 1946, he was found guilty of war crimes and crimes against peace. The tribunal sentenced him to 10 years in prison. Compared to others, it was lenient. Dönitz served his time in Spandau, then quietly disappeared from public view upon his release in 1956. He returned to a modest home near Hamburg, where he spent the rest of his life far from politics and headlines. Unlike Speer, he didn't seek redemption in bestseller lists or public interviews, but he did write a set of memoirs that offered insight into the naval war, his loyalty to Hitler, and the burden of being named successor to a dying dictatorship. His tone was defensive, firm, often unapologetic. He accepted the verdict, but not the moral weight others had carried. To him, he had done his duty. Karl Dönitz died in 1980, buried with military honors by former Navy men who saw him as a sailor, not a war criminal. Wilhelm Keitel and Alfred Jodl were soldiers, rigid, obedient, and utterly devoted to the chain of command. But in Nazi Germany, obedience became complicity, and both men followed orders until those orders led them to the gallows. From the earliest days of the war to its bitter end, Keitel and Jodl were the generals who signed the papers, issued the commands, and gave military legitimacy to Hitler's vision of conquest and annihilation. Keitel, as head of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the high command of the armed forces, was Hitler's top military advisor, a man who had surrendered his judgment in exchange for favor. Nicknamed La Keitel, or Yes Man Keitel, by his peers, he rubber-stamped nearly every directive the Führer proposed, from the invasion of Poland to the Night and Fog decree that legalized secret executions. Jodl, his deputy and chief of operations, shared that same blind loyalty. He helped plan the Blitzkrieg campaigns, coordinated field strategies, and signed off on orders that condemned resistance fighters and prisoners to summary death. They were not monsters in the traditional sense. They didn't scream speeches or lead death squads, but they made the machinery of the war run smoothly, and in Hitler's Germany, that machinery crushed millions. When the war ended, both men were arrested and brought to trial at Nuremberg. Their defense was one that the world would hear again and again. I was just following orders. But the tribunal wasn't interested in ritual obedience. The evidence was overwhelming. Documents bearing their signatures outlined illegal warfare, mass executions, and the deportation of civilians. They had been present, they had been informed, and they had given their consent. In 1946, Keitel and Jodl were found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. When Keitel heard his death sentence, he saluted the court, still wearing the uniform of a German field marshal. He requested to be shot as a soldier. The court denied him the honor. On October 16, 1946, he was hanged at Nuremberg. Jodl followed him to the scaffold shortly afterward, also denied the dignity of a military execution. Neither man left behind a confession, only a cold echo of duty gone astray. After the war, debates about their legacy simmered. In 1953, a German court briefly overturned Jodl's conviction in a symbolic ruling, only to reinstate it later under international pressure. The gesture revealed the lingering discomfort in post-war Germany, how to separate the military from the regime it served, how to reckon with loyalty that had been weaponized. Ernst Kaltenbrunner entered the highest ranks of the Nazi regime not through charisma or strategy, but through brutality. After Reinhard Heydrich's assassination in 1942, Kaltenbrunner was appointed chief of the Reichssecurity Main Office, an empire of repression that included the Gestapo, the criminal police, and the intelligence service. It was a position once held by one of the regime's most intelligent and ruthless operators. Kaltenbrunner lacked Heydrich's cunning, but he made up for it with raw, unquestioning violence. If Heydrich had refined the machinery of terror, Kaltenbrunner simply kept it running and pressed harder. Tall, scar-faced, and a devout Nazi from the early days of the movement in Austria, Kaltenbrunner saw himself as a soldier of the Reich's will. Under his command, the SS's reign of terror deepened. He coordinated mass deportations, oversaw the implementation of the final solution, and ensured that resistance, dissent, and even suspicion were met with disappearance or death. The camps were already operational when he took power, but Kaltenbrunner ensured they stayed efficient. As the war collapsed around him, Kaltenbrunner fled. In May 1945, he was captured by American troops in the Austrian Alps, hiding in a cabin and disguised in civilian clothes. He claimed that he had only been a lawyer, a man following orders, unaware of the worst crimes committed under his watch. It was a defense repeated endlessly in the months that followed, but few wore it less convincingly. At the Nuremberg trials, Kaltenbrunner sat in the dock, towering over the other defendants. He denied involvement in the Holocaust, claimed ignorance of the camps, and distanced himself from the inner decisions of the regime. But documents, witness testimony, and his own signature told a different story. He had signed deportation orders. He had approved executions. He had been briefed on the daily function of death. Even among the Nazis on trial, Kaltenbrunner stood out for the depths of his denials, brazen, absolute, and hollow. The court was unmoved. In 1946, Kaltenbrunner was convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity. The evidence had buried him. On October 16th, he was hanged alongside 9 other senior Nazis. He reportedly met his death without remorse, murmuring a final protest of loyalty to Germany, rather than regret for the millions whose lives had ended under his authority. Joachim von Ribbentrop had once stood in the gilded halls of Europe's embassies, shaking hands, signing treaties, and posing as the refined face of Nazi diplomacy. He wore tailored suits and affected airs of aristocracy, despite having started life as a wine salesman. But behind the elegant veneer was a man utterly devoted to Hitler, a servant of ambition who traded principles for power. As foreign minister, von Ribbentrop didn't just speak for the Reich, he enabled its lies, disguised its intentions, and turned diplomacy into a weapon of war. He was arrested by Allied forces shortly after the fall of Berlin, found in Hamburg with his papers and a quiet confidence that suggested he still believed himself important. At Nuremberg, that confidence unraveled. Seated in the dock with the other defendants, von Ribbentrop quickly became isolated, respected by none, distrusted by many. His attempts to charm or assert his innocence failed miserably. He blamed others, spoke in loops, and never fully grasped the weight of the crimes he had helped orchestrate. But the tribunal understood. Von Ribbentrop had been instrumental in negotiating the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the non-aggression treaty with Stalin that secretly carved up Eastern Europe. That agreement had paved the way for the invasion of Poland and the start of the Second World War. He had lied to foreign governments, pressured allies into submission, and stood silently as Hitler's promises collapsed into violence. Diplomacy under von Ribbentrop was never about peace, it was about delay, distraction, and betrayal. During the trial, he insisted he had known little, that he had been kept out of the loop, that he only carried out the Führer's will, but the evidence spoke louder. Memos signed in his hand, notes from strategy sessions, and testimonies from those who had seen him operate at the heart of Nazi foreign policy. He had been there from the start, right beside Hitler, as the world was pulled into chaos. Von Ribbentrop was sentenced to death. On October 16, 1946, he was the first to mount the gallows. Moments before the noose tightened, he muttered a final statement, a jumbled invocation of loyalty to God and Germany, insisting again that he had done his duty. Hans Frank was no general, no SS officer. He wore a suit, not a uniform, and wielded a pen instead of a pistol. But few men did more to legalize terror than he did. Appointed Governor-General of occupied Poland in 1939, Frank became the face of Nazi administration in the East, a man who turned bureaucracy into brutality. Under his rule, ghettos were sealed, forced labor was institutionalized, and millions of Jews and Poles were pushed through a system designed not just to control, but to destroy. He called himself the King of Poland. The people he ruled called him something else, the Butcher. Frank wasn't a battlefield commander. His war was fought through decrees, reports, and executive orders. He oversaw the destruction of Poland's cultural and intellectual life. approved the daily functioning of terror, and justified it all through law. His legal background gave Nazi atrocities a sheen of legitimacy, mass murder dressed in official stationery. He didn't give speeches like Goebbels or command SS units like Himmler. He simply made evil administrative. When the Reich collapsed, Frank fled to Bavaria. He was captured by American forces in May 1945. In his possession were thousands of handwritten pages, diary entries, meeting notes, legal justifications. They told a story of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. At Nuremberg, those diaries became central to the case against him. Faced with the evidence of his own words, Frank changed his tone. Unlike many others on trial, he admitted guilt. He wept. He spoke of repentance. He clutched a rosary and quoted scripture. He said the war had turned him into something unrecognizable. The judges were unmoved. Frank was sentenced to death for war crimes and crimes against humanity. On October 16, 1946, he walked to the gallows. Before the hood was placed over his head, he reportedly said, "I am thankful for the kind treatment during my captivity and ask God to accept me with mercy." Well, that's it. Thanks for watching. We hope you found this video informative. If you enjoyed learning about today's topic, check out our other video, What Happened to the Wives and Children of Nazi Leaders After World War II. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more World War II content. And we'll see you in the next one.